My name is Sarah Elizabeth Monroe. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a narrow brick row house in Cleveland, Ohio. The kind of house with a sagging front porch, maple roots lifting the sidewalk, and neighbors who still borrow sugar. Until a month ago, my life felt simple in a practical, exhausted way. I worked as a nurse coordinator at a community clinic. My days were elbows deep in charts and the small victories of people who could finally get a lifestyle medication they needed. And my evenings were quiet meals with Anna, my wife of 7 years, or long, distracted walks through the neighborhood to think myself into sleep. Lately, sleep stopped arriving altogether. Right now I am raw. My mother, Margaret Monroe, was in the ICU for 3 weeks after a hemorrhagic stroke. She is home now, fragile, angry, and at once childlike and terrifying. And I am the person she looks at when she needs someone to blame. I took leave from work to manage medications, therapists, and the exact ways a grown woman must be spoken to when she's relearning how to swallow. The house smells like antiseptic and our old living room candles, and underneath it all there is the cold, damp smell of the basement where we keep boxes of things we promise ourselves we'll sort through someday. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The day she came home from the hospital, the van that delivered her was too quiet. The driver said nothing about the shape of the ambulance bay, and the nurses handed me a thin folder that said, "Discharge instructions," in clinical blue letters. Her skin had the waxy sheen of someone who'd slept on a plastic sheet for too long. Her hair looked like a gray crown cut by scalpel hands. She held my hand like a child who had learned that hands could be trusted if you squeezed them hard enough. "You're too tired," she said to me like a reprimand, and then laughed like it was a joke. I laughed because that's what we did when language failed. We turned it into breath that fit the room. Having your mother come home is like bringing a hurricane into a house that has forgotten how to weather storms. The dynamics you had with her, the pulled threads of long-ago arguments, the waistband of guilt, the old patterns of caretaking, rearrange everything. Anna tried to adjust. She cooked softer foods, lowered her voice when she was near the bedroom, and asked questions in a careful, practiced tone. Anna is patient in ways I can never be. She can dissolve tension into practical actions. New rugs, non-slip mats, labeled pill organizers. It was Anna who reminded me to call the visiting nurse that first evening, who left sticky notes in the bathroom cabinet with dosages spelled out in round, mechanical letters. I watched her become the kind of person the kind of hospital wants at home. Stable, reliable, the kind of background that feels faintly like a promise. But promises fray. My mother's return didn't stitch the old wounds. It pulled at them. There are things that happened in my family that are not spoken aloud because talking about them would require rearranging the past into a shape that would not fit comfortably in any present. Anna, like she always does, started poking at those edges with the light touch of someone who wants to understand you better. She is curious to a fault. She asked questions about my father, about where the money went the year before he left, about slurred comments the family told off as, "He's always tired." And she dug through old photographs in the attic one rainy afternoon, looking at faces that had once smiled in our living room and now seemed to have been photoshopped out of time. The first weeks were a series of small catastrophes. My mother would confuse days. She'd pick the wrong names out of her mouth like a trick gone wrong. Sometimes she'd accuse Anna of stealing things. Once she woke up in the middle of the night and, certain she'd seen a shadow, yelled for me to get that woman out of the house. I would catch Anna's eyes in the dark, the flash of a person who had married me for better and for worse, who now had to live with the wreckage of my child's history. I began to believe I could be two people, the daughter with a duty, the wife with a private sorrow. My mornings began with a checklist and my nights with quiet, seething inventories of things I hadn't said. I lied to myself in small ways, that this was temporary, that once Mom relearned how to swallow and tie her shoes, we would drift back. Love does not get smaller when the world narrows. It gets tested. There were whispers, too. My younger brother, Luke, called more often. His voice tight with anger under the surface. "You always put her first," he'd say. "You let her make you small, Sarah." He kept asking questions about money, about estate plans, about why Dad's name wasn't on any of the original deeds. as if living with a sick parent and worrying about how the mortgage gets paid are things that can be separated. I didn't have the energy to argue with him. Family is a room full of people who think they're helping you by pulling at the loose thread in the hem of your life until it's time to stitch it again. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. The house, once a place of quiet domestic rituals, began to carry different sounds. The quick, brittle noise of my mother's plastic cup hitting the kitchen counter, the low rustle of Anna's breath as she cleaned around the place where my mother liked to sit, the muffled, exhausted laughter of me trying to make something like normalcy while every small decision felt like quicksand. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake with my mind running through all the possible failures. The wrong dose, the missed call, a paramedic thumping at the door, Luke arriving with a list of demands I wasn't prepared to meet. The basement door, though, was a relic. It was that old, groaning door at the back of the house with an iron latch and a smell of dust and cedar that made my throat go tight. In the summer it was cool down there. In the winter it held the damp, musky perfume of the earth itself. It was where we kept holiday decorations, boxes of things my father collected and never had the heart to throw away, and the big, ancient trunk that held my childhood toys. It was not a place someone visited often. It was the underbelly of the house, the storage of past selves. On a Tuesday the house settled into a heavy, rainy afternoon. The kind of rain Cleveland does in October where the squall seems to go on, blurring the streetlights and making the living room feel like a theater. I was in the kitchen folding bandage wraps while Anna was at the front talking quietly on the phone to a friend about a yoga retreat she wanted to take for 2 days. Nothing big, just a breath. My mother napped in her recliner, the television playing a show that made the apartment sound fuller than it was. The phone rang. It was Luke asking if he could stop by. I told him yes, just for a minute. We were both on edge and didn't realize it yet. When Luke walked in, he moved with a swagger that had always disguised his discomfort, and he put his hands in his pockets like he was carrying the weight of the world. He nodded at my mom, who nodded back without fully waking, and then he looked at Anna with a glance that had an edge to it I had not seen in him before. They said nothing. Luke went down to the basement to get a box of old invoices he claimed he needed. He'd always been the one to sort Dad's papers. He liked being the archivist of explanation. That was the last uncomplicated thing to happen. I had no way of knowing, standing in that thin light over the sink, that the day would turn and the cornerstone of our home would crack. I had made a promise to myself to keep everyone safe, to manage the medications and the schedules and the delicate humor necessary to survive a hospital discharge at home. I had not, in my wildest imagining, prepared to find the person I loved hidden beneath our mortgage and dust like contraband. I didn't know how to live in that breach between duty and truth. That was when everything began to tilt toward a place I had never wanted to go. I remember the sound first. A faint, animal sob that threaded up from underneath the house and lodged itself against the tile floor beneath my feet. It wasn't a sound a civilized human would openly make. It had corners, like an animal seeking shelter. I stopped folding bandages. Listened. For a second, I thought it was the television, or the wind threading itself through the eaves. Then it came again. A muffled voice, a word that might have been Sarah, and then nothing. My heart punched up into my throat. Anna! I called because that's what you do when your mind offers you the most plausible explanation. Anna, are you okay? Silence. The rain outside was a curtain. Inside, the house had that low, taut quiet of people who are waiting for a reckoning. My mother, who had been dozing, shifted and opened her eyes. She blinked up at me like an old lighthouse finally being noticed. My brother had left the basement when I first told him I needed space. He was hovering by the front doorway, his hands empty, his face the color of worry. She didn't answer, Luke said, and his voice was small. I went to the cellar door because the sound came from there. The basement door was something we rarely considered. The latch was stiff from disuse. The old key hung, useless, from a hook behind it. I reached for the chain and it was colder than I expected. A smell rose up as I opened it. The damp, turned-earth perfume of the basement, but sharper. The human metallic note that people recognize as fear. Anna! I called again, my voice thin in the open stairwell. It answered me a minute later. a strangled sound that could have been bravery or shame. I took the first step down and the concrete was cold and slick under my bare feet. The light bulb above flickered. The basement has always been dim, but it was the dim of old film reels and evergreen winters. There were boxes everywhere, the skeletal bones of my father's tools, Christmas lights tangled like dry seaweed. And then I saw her. She was leaning against the workbench, knees drawn up, hair in a messy braid, face streaked with tears. Her eyes were wide and red, and there was something frantic in her hands. One wrist had a bruise that swelled purple like a bruise on an apple. There was a padlock on a chain looped through the handle of the basement door. The chain was clumsy, the lock modern, the kind you buy with a feeling that you're about to make a decision that will outlive whatever made you afraid. "Sarah," she whispered, and the name came out like a prayer. For a moment I could only stand there, feeling the cold rise into my legs and the room spin because logic refused to fill in the space that fear had made. I reached for her and she flinched like she'd been waiting for the flinch, and it was now more real than anything. Her hands moved to the padlock and she shook it like shaking would make it yield. Then she looked up at me and said, "She did it. Mom did it." Those 3 words turned my brain into something like a courtroom and a battlefield at once. My mother, who was fragile, who had a diagnosis and a bedside manner that needed to be kind and soft, had locked my wife in the basement. Margaret would never. Came out like a child's defense. I wanted to say it louder, more certain. My voice sounded like a stranger's in my own ears. "She did," Anna said again, and the way her jaw clenched made the words solid. "She called me a liar. She said I was trying to take everything. She said." She stopped because she needed to breathe, and for a second the room was only the sound of my mother's faint breathing upstairs and the rain, which had become a steady, drumming companion. I ran upstairs to find my mother by the window, hands folded. Her face turned toward the dull sky like someone tracking the weather rather than tracking the moral weather of her own actions. "Ma," I said, and the title in my mouth felt like a coin with the edges worn off. She looked at me for a long second, and there was a confusion there that made me soften. "I did what I had to. You have to understand," she started, and I realized how quickly the hospital had become an explanation that people wanted to put on the table like a map instead of seeing the jagged, crooked truth beneath. She'd been lucid, the visiting nurse had said. She'd been confused, the other nurses said. She had episodes of paranoia and would sometimes think there were people in the house who came to steal from her. After everything is steeped in adrenaline, it is difficult to parse which part of action is real and which is a consequence of chemicals in the brain reasserting primeval fears. "No, Ma," I said, and the words came out raw. "You locked her in the basement." The admission made her fold like a cheap umbrella. She flung up her hands and then curled into herself. "I didn't mean to, I only wanted to keep you safe," she said, and the shape of a lifetime of blame is like a blade. Only a mother who had practiced being the center of terrible secrets could shape a sentence like that to sound almost like protection. Luke stood in the hall, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched. Anger moved through him like a current. "You can't do this," he said to Mom more than to anyone else, and in the way siblings do. He drew the outline of the thing that had always been present and never named, that our family has always kept things locked away. Anna was still leaning against the workbench. Her breath was rapid. Her hands shook. I knelt because it felt like the modest right action, to get down to her level, to be in a place where I could see the bruise and trace the way her fingers curled in. We had been married long enough that we had a language of wounds. The bite on your lip when you tried to hold back a comment, the way one of us would fold a napkin because hands that habitually tend need to be busy to keep sane. I put a hand on her arm and felt the tremor like a live wire. "Tell me," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "Tell me what happened." She told me then, in shards and held breaths. Mom had taken her aside that morning in the kitchen and accused her of stealing from the house. She had said things about people from 20 years ago, about Dad, about affairs, about money missing, as if Anna had orchestrated them. Anna told her she didn't know what she was talking about. She told her she had never stolen from us. Then, when the conversation turned into one of those cycles where old guilt lines into renewed accusation, my mother had gotten up and left the room. She'd returned with an old chain and a padlock, something the house had kept from better safe than sorry days. She'd said, "You can't be trusted with the house," and she had locked the door to keep her out. "It's ridiculous," Luke said, though his voice had an edge I couldn't read. "She should never have done that." I looked upstairs through the window at the placid Massachusetts sky and felt a new, sharp fracture. There was a part of me that wanted to run to the hospital again and demand someone call the police because that's the right and legal action. There was a part of me that wanted to fold this into some private argument and hide it behind closed doors because we still had to feed Mom and make sure she took her pills. There was a part of me that felt like it was all my fault for bringing her home at all. My hands were shaking. The basement concrete was cold through my socks. I had the sick, hollow feeling of someone who was being expected to choose the lesser of two real horrors. To protect my mother, who had been the architect of my childhood and now of my wife's captivity, or to protect my wife, who had given me safety and was now the one who needed to be saved. "Please," Anna said, looking at me with a plea that had nothing to do with marital vows and everything to do with survival. "Don't make me go back upstairs." It was the simplest of requests, and the most impossible. I reached for the padlock like someone reaching for a detonator. It felt small and metallic. My fingers found the cold ring, and I paused, aware that I was holding the weight of more than metal. I heard my mother's voice from the kitchen, weak and trembling, as if she were making an argument with herself. I heard Luke's shoes on the floor like a metronome to my indecisive pulse. I remember the taste of blood in my mouth. Not mine, but that coppery tang that rises when your adrenaline floods and your stomach forgets how to hold things. My hand faltered. For a second, every movement was a survey of consequences. Press charges and risk putting Mom in a facility, tell no one and keep the secret, call Luke and let him decide. My fingers closed on the lock. The moment I did, I felt a new and terrible clarity. Secrets had a way of becoming the chains we used to bind other people. And now here we were, with that chain wrapped around the precise place we'd rather not look. If you're following this and need to pause, that's okay. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. The rusted click of the padlock as I opened it still rings in my ears like a sound meant to startle the conscience. It was small and ordinary and mundane, the kind of sound made in hardware stores and forgotten in garages. Yet in my hands it felt monumental, like the instrumental chord before an orchestra of family history swelled up and filled every room. Anna's face was a map of sudden relief, but relief that came with threads of shame woven through it. I helped her up, and her knees were unsteady as if they had been in a different life entirely. We sat at the kitchen table while Mom sat in her recliner and looked at us like a woman who had played a part in a play and now awaited the reviews. Luke stood by the window, hands jammed into his pockets. His face set like someone who has been practicing disappointment for years. The rain had thinned, the house smelled like lemon cleaner and wet wool, and the evening seemed suddenly too small for the enormity of what had just happened beneath it. "I told you she was manipulative," Mom said, almost as if reciting a fact. Her voice had that brittle edge the nurse had warned me about. When you talk to someone who has suffered a stroke, you learn that some parts of their memory are like an old attic, boxes that keep everything in the wrong order. "Manipulative how?" I asked because curiosity is the scaffolding for understanding. I had worn myself into a thin strip of endurance, and I needed the facts to hold me steady. She named things I had heard in the half-faded murals of our childhood, that Anna had spoken to him, Dad, about money, that she had tampered with documents to make it easier for me to become his favored child, that she had stolen from the house in small, practical ways. The accusations were specific and dull in the way accusations are when people recite a script they've rehearsed in private. Anna shook her head. "I have never accessed any of your files, Margaret. I wouldn't even know where to start." Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I organize, Sarah. Clean. I ask questions because I love you. If that made you uncomfortable, we should have talked about boundaries." "Boundaries?" my mother said with a humorless laugh. "You come into my house and rearrange my furniture and suddenly you're arranging my life." It unfolded from there. Accusations that reached back like vines, wrapping themselves around our present. There were claims about my father, about debts that had been paid and ones that had been hidden, and a certain checkbook with a missing ledger. Luke, who had always maintained the role of the family's shadowed accountant, had for years kept ledgers in a shoebox that he said he would reconcile when he had time. The ledgers told stories of late-night phone calls, beer bought in bulk, a string of cash withdrawals that matched a period when my mother said we had been happy. The house had small pockets of truth we hadn't opened. "I found your father's journals," Luke said to me suddenly, and I felt as if the temperature had dropped. "There are things in there I hadn't thought we'd ever look at again." My stomach dropped. We always knew Dad had secrets. Affairs, money siphoned away in glances and half-words, but seeing it named made it a thing with edges you could cut. The ledger was proof of a more complicated past. Missing payments, a pattern of giving and taking that entangled everyone. My mother had been the center of the storm, the person everyone relied upon to keep a lid on it. Maybe that role had become a kind of identity, a line she couldn't cross without losing everything she thought she controlled. "I didn't want Anna to start pulling at threads," Mom said, her voice small now, "because when she started asking, I remembered the things I had always kept shut. I thought if I kept her out of the house she couldn't stir things up." Anna put her hands in her lap, silent. "You made a choice to lock me," she said. "You didn't have to do that." My mouth filled with 1,000 possible defenses. She was ill, she was confused, she was suffering. But the net of rationalizations felt thin. Protecting someone by violating their autonomy is a paradox I knew intimately. We had spent years of our life tolerating my mother's small cruelties because they came dressed in nostalgia and memory. But this was different. This was a chosen suppression that hammered home the point that secrets would be sealed no matter what. It took days to untangle the threads. The visiting nurse wrote notes about my mother's episodes, about paranoia and the cognitive pathways that sometimes misfire after a stroke. The social worker suggested a geriatric psychiatrist to evaluate cognitive stability. Luke argued that we should follow the law and document everything. Anna, understandably, wanted security. She wanted to file a report, to have proof, to make my mother answer for what she had done. And yet she also wanted me to love her and not betray the woman who had birthed me and raised me with all her contradictions. There were arguments that burned like acid. Between rounds of visits and forms, Anna and I had a private fight where we said things neither of us would have said in calmer times. I accused her of stirring trouble with an old wound she had no right to touch. She accused me of protecting a woman who had spent my childhood erasing me. We both said things that let us feel momentarily superior, noble in our fury. "You're choosing her over me," Anna said at one point, standing in the doorway of our bedroom, her voice raw. "I'm choosing the woman who raised me," I wanted to say, and the sentence ballooned into something shameful. Instead I stepped closer and tried to form words that were less like weapons. "I'm trying to choose both, Anna. I'm injured in how to choose." There is a particular kind of grief that comes when you realize the person you married is becoming collateral to your family's trauma. It's not that Anna didn't understand my family. It's that love doesn't inoculate someone from the poison of repeated small cruelties. We had been trying to live together within the ecosystem of my past. And now the ecosystem was collapsing. The legalities moved slow like ice on a river. The police suggested mediation. The hospital suggested increased supervision. The lawyer suggested conservatorship if my mother could not manage her finances or act without endangering others. It all felt like an escalation that would cost us more than money. "What about Dad?" Anna asked one evening as we stood in the kitchen and rubbed our temples. "Why does he never come up in any of this unless his name is around misdeeds?" That's when the real secret began to peel back like a layer of paint. There were letters, hidden under a false bottom in a chest my mother kept in her room. Letters from my father to my mother that were frank and raw and full of apologies. They were a catalogue of debts and guilt and a kind of slow admitting of things he had done to fill the pockets of his shame. And then, in a folder tied with twine, Anna found a sheaf of photographs and notes, evidence of an affair that had been going on between my father and someone in the community, with receipts and names and a bank account that had been used to funnel money. The evidence was not explosive in a cinematic way, but it was painfully human. Receipts, a motel keycard, a photograph of two silhouettes leaning in an embrace. It explained a lot. The late withdrawals, the way my mother had become a guardian of silence, the calculus of what it meant to keep a family whole. When I confronted my mother with the ledger and the letters, it was as if she had been revealed not as an agent but as a landscape. She wept not because she had been caught but because the map of her life, always folded and refolded to hide creases, was now unfolded. "I did what I had to do," she said. "I kept things from you to keep you from being hurt. I thought if I could patch the holes, your life could be simpler. By locking my wife in the basement," I said, and the words were a knife. She trembled and then said something unexpected. "I thought if she couldn't keep poking, if she couldn't find what's missing, we'd be protected from all the things we can't afford to look at." The rawness of that admission, that she had been acting not out of malice but out of a parent's terror of disintegration, did not excuse her. It matted the issue into human form. She sounded like someone who had been holding a house together with tape and prayer. That, in itself, is not heroic. It is fragile and selfish and painful. But it was honest. Anna, who had always been the person outside our construction of self, looked at her with a something like pity. "You need help," she said simply. "You cannot be the keeper of this family alone." And there it was, the pivot. Not whether my mother had locked my wife in the basement, that was a line crossed, but whether we could repair what was broken and how. We were at a crossroads where law and love collided, and neither offered a comfortable path forward. I realized as I looked at the three of them, my wife, my mother, my brother, that the truth isn't always a liberator. Sometimes it is a tool with which we carve away the parts of ourselves we can no longer afford to keep. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. We moved slowly, like people trying not to break a fragile vessel. Legal steps were taken, but always in the background. Consultations with a geriatric psychiatrist, a counselor for Anna and me, and a meeting with social services to arrange for a caregiving schedule that didn't leave my mother alone and prone to episodes. We tried, in a fumbling way, to build a buffer between the frequency of my mother's paranoia and the daily life we all wanted to keep. We set up medication reminders, locked certain private files, and created a list of emergency contacts with numbers that fit in the glove compartment of my car. But practical measures are not magic spells. They are decisions that must be lived with and enforced and constantly renegotiated. My mother would oscillate between remorse and defensiveness. 1 hour she would apologize and press a hand to my cheek with a sincerity that made me breathe easier. The next hour she would be convinced that someone was coming to steal the house from under her. Anna and I tried to rebuild. We went to couples therapy because love is not a static contract. It is a daily practice of understanding and forgiveness and sometimes bitter truth. We sat in a chair across from Dr. Levy and said things like, "I didn't feel seen," and "You took her side," and "I couldn't abandon her." We learned to say, "We're not okay," and then to follow up with, "But we're trying." Little things helped. We cooked together again, we took a weekend away that was mostly talking about nothing at all, and we tried to remind ourselves why we had chosen each other in the first place. Anna is a person who makes room. She can make a serious conversation feel like a table still worth setting. Luke was a harder case. He oscillated between wanting to be an arbiter of truth and wanting to hold on to the role of family accountant. I could see how much he wanted to be useful and how much he feared losing the control that allowed him to live inside a story where everyone else was the one who needed sorting. He voted, more times than not, for legal action. He wanted our mother declared incapable of handling finances. "We can't leave it like this," he would say. "One wrong day and it's all ruined." Ruined for whom? Anna asked him once, directly. "Is it ruined for you? Or is it ruined for the people who have to live with the consequences?" He had no answer. No answer is a kind of answer. His silence weighed more than the loudest argument. Sometimes families are held together by no more than the need to be right. There were smaller, quieter battles. The VA representative came by one afternoon to talk about benefits. My mother hated the formality of people writing on clipboards next to her recliner. She shrank under questions, under the necessity of ordering herself into categories. She began to thrash with small verbal accusations when people asked her about money. She accused Anna of being meddlesome and calculating, as if those words could be brandished like weapons to force her attackers to retreat. The truth is, my life became a litany of choices where every choice cost something we loved. I remember one night, months in, when I found an old photo of my father in the attic. Him young and smiling with a beer in hand, and my mother, hair pinned, eyes tired. I sat on the attic floor and let the image become another piece of evidence in the ledger of things I had never wanted to know. I thought about forgiveness in the long sense. Forgiveness doesn't undo cruelty. It decides not to be owned by it. Yet we could not avert the law forever. The social worker recommended a conservatorship after a battery of tests, and after more nights spent in wrangling with guilt than any of us cared to count, we agreed. Felt like giving up and saving at once. The judge looked at us like a person peering into an intricate mechanism and trying to decide which gears to remove. In the end, for her safety and for the stability of our household, partial conservatorship was put into place. It was limited. My mother retained certain rights, but major financial decisions required oversight. We hired a part-time caregiver and set up surveillance equipment in the house, not to spy on my mother, but to protect myself and Anna should a real crisis occur. I hated it and I needed it. There was still the court of private relations to sit in. Anna, ever generous, did not pursue criminal charges. The local attorney explained that the law is complicated when a cognitively impaired adult commits a crime against another adult in the family. We chose mediation and a set of clear boundaries. No unsupervised contact between Mom and Anna for the time being, a schedule of visits with family members present, and a requirement that my mother undergo regular cognitive assessments. The agreement read like the minutes of a tense truce. Living in that truce was the real work. I went to bed at night with the exact feeling of my life being divided by a thin line of reason and chaos. I would wake up and check my phone, see a message from Anna that said something like, "I love you," and then watch my mother in the living room, knitting in a slow, deliberate way as if she were stitching a future that didn't belong to anyone else but herself. Sometimes I lost patience in ways I now regret. There were afternoons when I snapped like a dry twig. I would say something sharp to my mother and see the way her shoulders folded in like a map losing a fold. I would apologize and then think to myself, why do I keep apologizing for the person who caused this? Guilt is an ugly, complicated animal. One night, months after the basement incident, Mom called me in the middle of the night with a panic in her voice. "They're coming," she whispered, and for a pulse I felt that old terror. Anna slept on the couch, because the house had too many memories in the bedroom. I went to the living room and found Mom shaking like a reed. I sat with her, held her hand, and tried to be the anchor she had always needed and that I had inherited by blood. We talked for a long time about the past, about Dad, about money, about the reasons she had decided to be silent for so long. "I was afraid," she said simply, "and fear is perhaps the most human of motives. I thought if I told you everything it would fall apart. I didn't know how to be anything other than the one who kept it together." I looked at her and the years of my life unfurled like film. There is a kind of love that binds you to a parent regardless of their sins. The womb of memory, the early imprint of being cared for. But there is also a kind of bravery required to step outside your role, the daughter who defends a mother no matter the evidence, and choose something different. Little by little, we rebuilt trust like an object made from broken glass reassembled with patience. It was never the same thing, but it was some version of something we could live within. My mother learned to accept limitations not as traps but as support. Anna accepted boundaries that were painful but necessary. Luke continued to hover, his hands always busy with the paperwork of guilt and obligation. The basement, for a long while, remained a scar. I would go downstairs sometimes to get a box of winter clothes and feel the residual cold. But we lit a lamp there and left a space for sunlight when we could. The lock lived in my hand for a while, awkward and useless. I put it in the top drawer of the kitchen, a small relic of the day when secrets were almost more powerful than love. If you're still with me, please leave a comment or tap the like button. Hearing from you helps in ways I can't describe. The months after the conservatorship were not cinematic. They were incremental, domestic, stubbornly ordinary. Mom learned to accept the caregiver who came twice a week, to trust that certain papers had to be signed in the presence of another adult. She confessed in small, fragile moments about things she had kept secret, and each confession was a little like clearing our throat after a long silence. Painful, necessary, and slightly freeing. Anna and I put our marriage into a different container. Not one where one of us carried the other's history like luggage, but one where we carried, together, what had to be carried. We took turns being furious and tender. We argued about money and therapy, and whether visiting a mother once a week was enough or a betrayal. We fought over our future, and then sat with our hands intertwined afterward like two people who had gone to the edge and decided to come back. Luke took a job that kept him out of the house more often. He reconciled with the idea that he could not be the sole keeper of the ledger. The fact that our father had secreted some of his life away did not make him evil. It made him human and flawed. We learned to name that without turning it into an excuse for what's been done. There were apologies. Not the "I'm sorry you feel that way" kind, but the hard, honest apologies that rearranged the furniture of the heart. My mother told Anna she was sorry for everything she had done, including the basement. Anna accepted the apology slowly, like a hand taking the hem of a delicate dress, and then taught me something important about forgiveness. That it's not a single act but a series of choices to keep showing up. We celebrated small triumphs. Mom relearned to make her favorite soup without burning it. She laughed at something on television, and the sound filled the living room and seemed to make it larger. Anna and I took a trip to the lake and sat on a dock while dusk painted the water silver. We did not forget the basement or the bruise on Anna's wrist. We let them be parts of our story but not the headline. Most of all, I learned that family is not a static thing you must defend against the world. It is a set of decisions you make every day about whom to trust, what to forgive, and what you cannot allow to happen in your house. There is a difference between protecting someone and enabling behavior that harms others. There is also a difference between accountability and annihilation. We tried to find the balance. Cannot say we all healed. Some things remain raw, and they probably always will. But there is a steadier rhythm now. My mother receives her mail with less suspicion. Anna sleeps through the night more nights than not. Luke calls when he says he will. And I have learned how to be a daughter and a wife without erasing one for the other. We learned the hard way that secrets demand light. They twist into instruments when left in the dark, used by those who fear exposure. But truths, even the ugly ones, have a liberating bluntness. They require us to make hard choices and then live with them. That is where growth lives. Right after the moment you choose to act with messy, human courage. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing, even if it's just to remind yourself and others that complicated families exist and that choosing love sometimes requires great trouble. Has something like this ever happened to you? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. I keep the padlock in a drawer now. It is a small, metallic reminder of the day everything changed. Sometimes I take it out and hold it while I think. Keeps me humble. Keeps me aware that choices have weight. The basement door is unlocked, and sometimes we sit on the stairs and talk about the things that used to be buried. The conversations are awkward and honest and thin and real. If there is a lesson I can offer at the end of this, raw, imperfect, human, it's that protection without consent is imprisonment, even when born of fear. And that love, messy as it is, must be brave enough to look at the faults in the houses we inherit. We don't get to choose the family we're born into, but we do get to decide how we will love and how we will hold each other accountable. We can make promises and break them and make them again. We can apologize and rebuild. We can lock doors and then learn which ones we should never lock again. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more true things from messy lives like mine, please subscribe. It means that our little true tales get to be heard, and sometimes that's the place where healing starts.